Welcome to this short video that explains the picture book assignment. Why a picture book assignment? Well, this will take a bit of explaining, but in this course one of our goals is to understand the potential of design in the elementary curriculum. Design, designing, and creating educational experiences for students sort of go hand in hand, I'd like to suggest. How come? Well, let's first consider what designing is. In general terms, we could say that designing is a process that leads to a tangible thing. But what's really important to get hold of is that this thing can perform. Imagine if you were designing a board game that had a theme to it, and of course most board games do. As a designer, you would be challenged to apply your understanding of this theme as part of developing the game and making it work. Making it work means that others can come along, others who of course didn't make the board game, read the rules that you've developed, identify the components that you've referenced in the rules, and actually play it successfully. Okay then, but what makes designing educational? Well, making something that works, and works well, is kind of a big deal. The Monopoly game works. It can be actually enjoyed by people other than the designer. Designing requires us to be attuned to functionality, how specific things work or function, how essays function if you were designing an essay, for example, how board games function in this example. And notice that functionality is a social concept. The game has to function for others. It belongs to the world or practice of game playing. That means then, when we're designing a thing, we've got to be awake to the meaning potentials, to the genres, if you like, of the thing we're designing. If you were designing a board game that had the theme of the American Civil War, you would have to deploy your understanding of the important moments in the American Civil War, presumably, in order to make a history board game like that. And you would have to know something about how board games work. It would be enormously helpful if you had had experience of different board games, or that you'd been shown different board games, so you could get a feel for the genres and subgenres of these things. So in a design process, there's a great deal of synthesizing of different kinds of understandings as you pursue something that ultimately has to work, has to function. And basically, that's what makes it educational, this kind of opportunity designing affords. And of course, designing is challenging, but also potentially very satisfying, especially when the product has been made and tested and performs meaningfully. So in sum, to say that designing requires us to be attuned to functionality is saying that designing something is an act of meaning making where the object we create can actually perform, do its thing in a social world. But it is challenging. Yet for educators, a challenge for students, so long as it's not out of their ballpark, is generally thought to be a very good thing, an asset. Without going into detail here concerning Vygotsky-inspired theories of learning development, zone of proximal development, ZPD and all that, Jerome Bruner was the person I think who first articulated that, we know as educators that experiencing challenges along with smart and sensitive scaffolding provided by knowledgeable others is at the heart of developing ever wider circles of proficiency. So in addition to functionally informed meaning making, here's another potentially educational thing about designing. When designing, we can use each other to collaborate and discuss our design issues and ideas. Designing can be experienced as an opportunity then to collaborate. I chose this picture because I could imagine that these children are engaged in an act of collaboration around their design issues. I could imagine that they are using language to discuss how to make their designs work better. Wouldn't it be great if they were considering different approaches, considering what resources in the board game genre are worth deploying, for example? But let's be realistic. We can also wonder, and should wonder, about the quality of their collaboration. Are they really in tune with the functional demands of the thing they are designing? And can they use language to articulate these demands? Just because we've played a few board games wouldn't automatically mean that we are in a position to design our own version without some support. We need to have had our attention drawn to some of the essential generic features of board games and start to acquire a somewhat technical language to identify what is going on in the way board games work. Designers talk technically. So to promote good designing collaboration in our classrooms is going to require careful curriculum planning and built-in scaffolding that sequences tasks and capitalizes on the meaning-making resources of the thing it is we're designing. So I hope all this is enough, at least for now, to persuade you that having students behave like designers is not only likely to be engaging, but that the notion of designing itself is a really powerful concept to keep in mind when we consider whether our teaching is promoting an educational experience. When we think of managing our lessons, when we think of designing activities for our students to do, when we think of the design of our own curriculums generally, we could ask, are we doing a sufficiently good job of encouraging students to behave like authentic designers? And though I'm not going to say any more here, we might also ask whether this concept of design is something that should be applied to all areas of the curriculum: math, science, social studies, and not just the arts. Well, whatever we think of this from a teaching perspective, I'd like us to actually taste this design idea by actually designing something, namely a picture book. Unfortunately, for the first few stages of embarking on this project, we won't be doing it in a face-to-face collaborative way, as we'll all be starting in the privacy of our own homes, and I'm not expecting you to share your work online right now. But just know that when we come together as a group in real time, when we actually come together and meet, that will change, and we'll be in a better position to really experience the power of design collaboration, I hope. Alright, so a picture book. What is that exactly? Well, it's tempting to think that a picture book is merely any book that has a narrative that happens also to be illustrated with pictures. And there are some lovely examples of these, and some of them have rightly become sort of classics in their own right. But are these picture books? Well, I'd say that some of them come closer than others if we're wanting to be more technical about how we might use the term picture book. In more technical terms, a picture book is any narrative book where the pictures don't merely illustrate the text, but actually carry much, if not all, of the burden of communicating the story or the eventfulness of the work. Even though a picture book may have a very memorable text, the wild things roared their terrible roars, and gnashed their terrible teeth, and rolled their terrible eyes, and showed their terrible claws. A picture book without its images just wouldn't be the same. The images are very important and communicate most of the story, and sometimes all of the story, in wordless picture books. And because wordless picture books are in a sense the purest form of picture book, our way into our design project will be to start by looking at what it takes to tell a story purely in pictures. And to do this, we're going to start by considering some real basic elements of pictorial storytelling. We'll start with a blank sheet of paper. Blank sheet of paper is really terrifying. So let's put a frame on it. The frame is saying that something is going to be communicated within it. Okay. What is this? Well, let's add another frame. And let's put something else in the second one. Because we read from left to right, there's a good chance we'll read these two frames as somehow connected by the passage of time. This convention helps us narrow down the possibilities of what we're looking at. The line across the frame could be read as the horizon, perhaps. while the image in the second suggests the sun is rising. But not necessarily. And of course, if we can see all three frames together, that helps us disambiguate the first one. So here, the horizontal line turns out not to be the horizon, but the top of a wall perhaps. But let's stick with telling the story of the sun rising. In a picture book, the images are often placed within frames that are read from left to right and then down from top to bottom, just like text. And the frames work together. They reference each other to create a coherent meaning. So I'd like us to explore this notion of coherent storytelling. We're going to explore it by drawing upon two chapters from Uri Shulowitz's book, Writing with Pictures. This is going to be a great resource for us, this book, but for now we'll be concentrating on the section that has to do with telling the story, especially pages 18 to 29. So check these out for more detail on what's coming up in this presentation. But even though it's important, don't get bogged down with all the technicality. The most important thing is really to get your pencil and paper out and start drawing. In fact, to be honest with you, if I was doing this in a face-to-face way with you, I wouldn't start with all this technicality as I'm doing now. I'd actually have you kind of struggle a little bit and draw a story. Well, not struggle, but let's make a picture book and not worry about how we do it or any of the technicality that I've been getting into. And there's a kind of a principle that I think is a really important one for teachers to think about. Fireworks week 1, okay. How to make gunpowder week 5. Get the idea? As a general rule of thumb, having a go as curious but totally untutored amateurs is a really good thing, because it sets the stage for later really wanting to know things a bit more technically that can help you out. Okay, I hope that's that's kind of my defense of what I'm doing here in a way, because unfortunately we're not starting with fireworks. I'm having you watch this video, and I'm going to show you how to make gunpowder, so to speak. Okay, so what we're going to do is design a story told in pictures, and of course, please don't worry about making it polished. This is meant to be work in progress, rough work. It's sort of a time to work out your ideas and share them when we come together. So don't worry about using stick figures, for example. Whatever you think it means to be an artist, you don't have to be one in order to pull off telling a story in images. Just remember that. So back to a series of images that are familiar to us and can be read quite easily as the sun rising. By the way, these are similar to the ones Shulowitz uses as part of explaining the issues of readability. Readability basically means we can read something easily. So this has great readability. Why is that? Well, one reason is that there is a clear distinction between the actor and stage. That is, between that which is fixed and that which is not. The horizon line is the stage and is fixed, while the sun is the actor, the thing that is changing. But look at this sequence. This sequence presents us with some issues because it isn't clear how actor and stage are relating to each other. As Shulowitz points out, we're confused about who the actor is and what the stage is, since both the horizon and the sun seem to be moving. So how are we to read this? Is the earth changing? Well, without more context, it would be very hard to say. So making it work so it can be read, readability, basically amounts to us being able to read the action from one frame to the next. For example, what's the story here? Well, it would be much better if we had a frame. And better still, a stage that provides a sense of place and more clearly helps to define the role of the actor, in this case the car. So let's say a little more about this actor and stage idea using Sholowitz's illustrations. Here stage and actor are not separate elements as in the other examples. The boy's eyes and mouth constitute the actor, while the rest of his face serves as the stage. Well, look at this one. The egg in this sequence is both actor and stage, until the fourth frame when the chick emerges and becomes the new actor, if you like, with the egg now as the stage. This one, again, it's from the Sholowitz book, is interesting because it shows that the actor, or what you might think is the sun, since it's the moving element, you might think that the actor is the sun here, may not actually be the point of attention. The static castle seems to draw us in. What's going on in it? Perhaps this is going to be a story set within a castle. The actor stage roles have been reversed here. This one seems like a pretty straightforward and coherent story that we can easily read, but Sholowitz thinks this version of it, this one, is confusing. The second one here. Why does he think it's confusing? Well, he says that the fourth frame removes the horizon lines and depicts the energy of the crash instead. A new use for lines compared to the other frames. Is that okay? What do you think? This is Edward Muybridge, and he was a British Victorian photographer famous for his pioneering work in motion study. In fact, here's a famous example that he made showing a racehorse in action. If you were to make a flip book out of these images, you'd have an animation, a film as it were, of this animal in motion. But as frames in a picture book, the movement between the actor in each frame is too slow and subtle, making it kind of hard to read and maybe sort of boring. Imagine this as a picture book. This sequence, again from the Sholowitz book, is much faster and more appropriate for a picture book, perhaps. What do you make of this one? Alright, well, let's tell a more complicated story. What's the story here, and is there something wrong with it? To test that the story can be read, we should be able to describe what's going on. It seems somewhat clear that there are some disturbing elements. What do you think? Is there enough context or staging? Is frame 2 the car that belongs to the character placed in his or her garage? The car in frame 3 is presumably the same car, but it might have helped to have the car in frame 2 facing the other way. You know, in filmmaking this is called continuity. Picture books share quite a bit of the same sort of grammar as filmmaking. What are the actor and stages in 3 and 4? Would it have been better if the sun's position had remained relatively static and the car the same size? What happened to the car in frame 5? Seeing a part of it might have been a bit more reassuring and helpful. Alright, well, let's look at this one. Even though there are fewer frames here, I think you'll agree this is a lot more coherent, isn't it? Shulevitz points out that frame 1 basically combines the action of frames 1 and 2 of the first example. Also, frames 2 and 3 shows a transition from city to the countryside. That's kind of nice. The moving sun now seems more natural. Would you agree? Left to right, indicating the day is moving on. Notice that the drawing isn't any more sophisticated than the first one, just that the grammar of pictorial storytelling has been more thoughtfully applied. Right? So that's something to be really aware of here. You don't have to be a great artist here. You just need to know some of the techniques of pictorial storytelling. Okay, back to something very simple. Ouch. Quite a few problems with reading this one. What needs to change? If you were having a design conference with the designer of this, what might you want to bring up? Shulevitz provides this one as an example of much clearer storytelling. The girl gets up and starts a new day. There seems to be something quite lively about it, really. This one is clear too, but Shulevitz criticizes it as being a bit stereotypical. Girl meets boy. What do you think? There's a little surprise in this one. The dog follows the boy. They seem to be together, even though they're not on a the dog's not on a leash, but they seem to be together. And instead of the dog going into the boy's house, he goes into his own house. Cute. This one also has a surprise, and it's worth studying carefully. The first 3 frames do not prepare us for what happens in the last 3. You agree? Notice the object on the windowsill, and that same object is on the floor in frame 5. Pumpkins, Halloween and witches. Surprises are fun and get us thinking. Well, I'd like to end with some samples of students' work. So I'm not going to comment on any of these. I'm just going to leave them on the screen for a few seconds, and you can study them and make what you will of them. All right. Some of those stories were easier to read than others. I'm sure you'll agree. Good luck with your own sketches. We're going to call this part 1, assignment 1, and you're going to create a storyboard of just like the ones you've seen, really, but your own ideas. And then I want you to imagine that once we've done a few of these, we'll consider really working on one of them as being the basis of a picture book, and each frame might even become a page or part of a double page spread of an actual book that we would consider designing. But for now, we're just going to concentrate on telling stories pictorially for this step 1, and having as much fun as we can with it. So I look forward to seeing what you come up with. Alright, thanks a lot for watching this. See you soon.